David, welcome back, my friend.
Hey, George.
Before we get into this new documentary, how did you get involved in this?
Well, many years ago, I was doing some peripheral research at a national park, and I saw some park rangers following me around. And at the end of the day, they ended up back in my room. One of them was knocking on the door. I invited him in, and he says, "Hey, Dave, we know who you are. We've been following you around, and we want to tell you a story." And it turns out that these two individuals had worked at national parks in the past and had been involved in missing persons investigations. And they noticed that during the first 7 to 10 days, there's a lot of publicity, there's a lot of hula going around. Then after that, there's nothing. And these guys started to compare notes, and they applied through their own Freedom of Information Act, trying to get documents from their own Park Service. They couldn't. And they thought that there was something strange going on because the disappearances and the circumstances surrounding them were pretty unusual. So they said, Dave, you have the background, you've done some books, you should look into it. So I left the park, called some law enforcement people. I said, hey, check into this and see if there's many missing people at this park. They came back and they said, wow, there's a lot of people. And it goes back a long time. And that's kind of how it got started. I did a Freedom of Information Act request against the National Park Service for a list of missing people inside their system, and they said they maintain no list. So I stated that I was a published author and I wanted them to put the list together. They said they wouldn't, but if I gave them $1.4 million, then they would.
I've always tried to pin you down to your thoughts on what you think is happening, why these people are disappearing, and I could never get you to say specifically because it's wide open. Can I assume when we give the title to this new documentary that this is possibly the reason why they're disappearing?
So I like to look at myself as somebody who just presents facts. I'll let the audience kind of decide which way they're going to go with it. But I think that you'd have to be a complete fool not to think that they are playing some role in what's happening here.
Could it be a combination of many different things?
I think that's possible.
Folks, the name of David's latest documentary is called Missing 411, The UFO Connection. How did you get to this point, David?
Well, that's quite a road. I have a lot of friends in the UFO community, and just by the 50-plus times I've been on your show, that there's a lot of people that contact me afterwards and say, hey, you ought to look into this, you ought to look into that. So I've been all over the gamut. I've looked at crypto topics. I've looked at UFOs. We've looked at animal predation. We've looked at people who just want to disappear, who just want to fall out because of mental health issues. And through all of that, we started on this third documentary. The first two were, first one was about young children who disappeared in the wilderness, and I wanted to catch people's attention. In that movie, it was about young kids who disappeared in the phenomenal distances that they were found away from the point last seen, in distances too far that would make any sense that they could have traveled on their own. Second one was about a group of hunters. This is Missing 411, The Hunted. And in that movie, we covered some hunters who disappeared under some highly unusual circumstances with some great witnesses, some sheriffs, and explaining that, even these people were armed in the wilderness. They still didn't come back. And from that movie, I got a lot of interesting feedback from people, including some sheriffs and some rangers. And during that research of this, it fell into, well, first of all, let's talk about the abduction of animals.
Okay.
And we've kind of scratched on that, and your show has scratched on it a lot with, say, cows being mutilated.
Mutilated, sure.
And part of that was I got a hold of a man, and he told me about an event that happened in Washington where a group of workers were on the side of a hillside, and they saw this UFO come into this valley below them and hover over this one elk and pick it up without the use of any cords or ropes. They didn't understand how it picked it up, and it just lifted it away. Well, MUFON did an investigation on that case and put some really good investigators on it, and the end result was they thought they might have found that elk quite a distance from where it disappeared, But then the company found out that this area had been inundated by chronic wasting disease. And that kind of perked my interest. You know, an elk disappearing under those circumstances where there's a lot of chronic wasting disease. Okay. Well, then I met a group of hunters that were in Idaho, and they were camped deep, deep in the woods. And one of the hunters goes out in the middle of the night from their camper, and he sees this giant UFO hovering right above the trees.
Wow.
And that's the movie poster for the movie. And he yells, and the other hunters come out, and we interviewed these guys. And they'd hunted this area many times. And it turns out that the location where this happened was just 9 miles east from a case we covered in our first movie, The Disappearance of Dior Kuntz in Idaho. And then, just 14 miles north, there was another hunter who disappeared 53 years earlier and had never been found. And while we were out there filming this, a group of hunters found this individual's remains in an area that had been searched probably 50 times.
Amazing.
And then suddenly he's there. So that's kind of how we all got started on it. And it seemed, honestly, George, as though I was being led by my nose to look into these things. It's like fallen into my lap.
It's very logical. You know, it makes sense because people are disappearing, as you pointed out, David, over the years, without a trace, without a sound. Some people are just walking behind their friends and family, and they're gone all of a sudden. And and I thought originally when I first started talking with you, there's a serial killer on the loose out there, but you're going to hear somebody scream or a mountain lion grab somebody real fast. You're going to still hear somebody scream. Nobody hears anything, do they?
No, there's, just like you said, there's families out in the woods, and a parent will say, my son was right next to me. And I turned around for just a few seconds, and he was gone, and I don't even think that he could get out of that area that quickly. And they bring in professional trackers, and there's no tracks leaving the area. And then they bring in canines, and one of the profile points that we live by is that the canines that come in can't pick up a scent. And that is not normal.
No, not at all. And have you talked in the documentary about how these UFOs may be snatching people?
Well, that's something that it's pretty vague about. We interviewed one person who was in his 90s, and back in the 70s, he was hunting, and one of the first times he ever hunted alone. And as he was out there, a UFO apparently landed near him. And he says that he saw 3 elk, and he lines up on the elk to shoot him, and he says, the strange thing, Dave, is that these elk were almost like statues, but they were huge. And he goes, I fired my gun, and he says it was almost like in slow motion. The bullet comes out the end of the gun, and it hits something, like very close to where I'm standing, and the bullet falls to the ground. He goes, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So he goes, he walks over, he picks up the bullet, puts it in his pocket, and then he describes a humanoid comes walking towards him in strange clothing and says, you're hungry, huh? He nods, and he kind of throws this packet to him, and he says, it would almost remind you like a packet of vitamins. He says, Dave, I know it sounds crazy, and who knows why I took them, but I took them. And he said, the next thing I remember is I wake up inside this ship, and I turn around, and the 3 elk that I was lined up on are sitting almost frozen inside the ship. And he said, we're talking, and the guy goes, yeah, we're going to take this ride. And he says, well, you took my elk. And he says, yeah, we come here, and we take elk occasionally and deer, and then we go to the ocean, and we take some things there. And he says, we're going through space, and he says, we're looking out a window, or I'm looking at a screen of something, and I see what I think is Earth getting smaller and smaller in the distance, and we end up at this location. And we get out, and he says, we see some other people that kind of look like they're from Earth, and they're dressed like us, and they asked me to walk behind this screen, and I walk behind it, and he says, he comes out, and they said, yeah, you're not what we need. And he goes, what do you mean? And he goes, yeah, you're not full. You're not You're just not what we need.
Jeez.
And I asked him, I said, so what did that mean to you? And he says, well, I had a vasectomy, and I think it's because I had the vasectomy they didn't need me.
And they knew it.
They knew it. And he said, so they take me, and within a short period of time, he says, they drop me, and I roll down this hill back where I was hunting. And right there is something huge in this interview that I got. I've talked in my books that there's an abnormal amount of people that seem to have fallen in areas in the wilderness that make no sense at all. How they got there, why they fell in that location, made no sense.
No, like they're plopped down or something.
Right. And many times they're missing key pieces of clothing. And it's not that the fall took off the clothing. Something happened and this clothing disappeared. And in this case, this man said that he injured his shoulder during this fall. And I said, you're positive that you fell? He goes, 100%. He said, the minute I was dropped, I hit the ground. I was awake, but I didn't know exactly where I was, but I was probably in the same wilderness area, as it turned out. And I started to try to figure out where I was and get myself out of there. Well, it turns out that his wife had already, he'd been late. Search and rescue was out looking for him. And they eventually found him. And they took him to the hospital. And his doctor shows up there. And in his youth, he had tuberculosis. And he had severe tuberculosis scars on his lungs. Well, they did a complete physical on him, and he didn't have any tuberculosis scars anymore.
Jeez, they cured him.
Cured him. And surprisingly, he still had this bullet that he picked up off the ground that hit something. And they turned that over to the Wyoming Department of Fish and Game, who turned it over to Wyoming Criminalistics. And they said, this bullet hit something, but it's like it hit something we've never seen because it didn't split and come apart like a normal bullet would. So not only did he have this lung issue cleared, but he also had this bullet. And he ended up seeing a psychologist because it bothered him so much. And it was the opinion of this psychologist from the University of Wisconsin that he had really gone through what he said. And then subsequent to that, he went through 2 different polygraph tests, and the examiner said, well, we can't tell you if this happened or not, but this man 100% believes what he's telling us.
That's amazing. Of give me a percent of the people who are taken, how many never return?
Well, it's probably 50%.
50%. Okay, of the 50% that do come back, how many of those, what percent of those are alive as opposed to killed or dead?
Oh, it's probably, that fit our profile, the ones that we research, probably maybe 10%.
10% are dead.
Yeah.
So the other percent that comes back, do they have any recollection of anything?
No.
Nothing.
No.
But do they know they were even gone?
That's the problem. They don't remember going missing. They don't know how they came out. They don't know the track they took to where they were found. It's like a complete blank.
How many of them are nude as opposed to in their same clothes?
That's a small percentage, but a larger percentage are found missing pieces of either clothing or shoes, and they can't explain how they lost them.
All right, so can we assume, based on the documentary Missing 411, The UFO Connection, that some of these occupants, a great many of them, are returned by the UFOs, by the ETs?
I would say that you'd have to be a fool not to put the pieces together like we did in this movie. Now, this hunter disappeared in a portion of a state where I had written about it before. And there were a large number of hunters that disappeared in this area. And when you look at the demographics of them, it's stunning. First of all, they were all German. Now, that seems almost impossible.
That's weird.
Very weird. And when you carry that out even further, for the people who have read my books, Hunters are a subgroup of the missing. Another subgroup that I've written about are physicists who have disappeared, many times in the wilderness. They are all German. I could not find one physicist anywhere in the world ever that disappeared that wasn't German.
That is strange. Of those that are returned, why are they returned and some may be kept?
That's a good question. The man I interviewed about this didn't really have an answer on that, but I did ask him. I said, so the implication that you made is that if you didn't have the vasectomy, you weren't coming back? He kind of looked at me and he goes, yeah, I think that's right.
Jeez. So one could assume, here we go again, that there's some kind of massive hybrid breeding program going on?
So one of the things I talk about at the beginning of the movie is, should we look at ourselves as the ant farm of the galaxy, let's say? And every once in a while, somebody from somewhere comes here to get some new DNA and takes it away. And in that ant farm idea, and you look at that and think it's Earth, and the number of different pockets of DNA there are around the world, meaning from different nationalities, races, etc., you could really have your time on this world doing that without anyone really putting the pieces together over eons.
David, aside from the apparent health purposes of the person who's abducted, whether they're healthy or not, what about the possibilities that they're professionals as opposed to laborers, anything like that? Do the ETs pick them based on career or anything?
So I don't know, but if you extrapolate the hunters that are missing in this one area, and then you look at the other subgroup of the physicists, there's another subgroup of people that have long-term hereditary type diseases that if you looked at them walking down the trail, you would never know. But then doing the background research on them, a lot of these, there's a subgroup of missing people that have serious congenital long-term diseases. And it's odd. Say some might be diabetic. Mm-hmm. Some may have emphysema. Some it's across the board. Epilepsy is another one. And you think, wow, that's... And after I did like 400 or 500 cases and I saw the number of people that disappeared that had these, then you think, well, they really couldn't have traveled that far with that disease, so why weren't they found? And most of the time, they're never found.
Strange. So none of these people who are returned have any kind of recollection at all. God, that would be so important for you.
So strangely, this one hunter has held his story since the 70s, and it's still the same. And, through UFO abductions, I've done a lot of those interviews, too. Some people do get a memory back over time if they go through hypnosis, etc., but many of them still can't remember exactly what happened.
There are some who believe Bigfoot is an extraterrestrial. Were you able to put that together at all?
Not here, no.
Not on this one. All right. Let's go back to the chronic wasting disease. Explain the CWD for us.
So it's the greatest natural disaster that's happening in the United States right now, and a great many Americans do not know. And it's the same in Canada, too. Chronic wasting disease is a prion disease. And the same way they had mad cow disease in the 70s in Great Britain, it's also a prion disease. And Great Britain told the citizens that it would never pass from animal to human and not to worry about it. Well, it did, and it ended up killing a lot of people. And the UK killed millions of cows trying to get rid of the disease. Well, this disease, chronic wasting disease, is essentially the same type of disease, except it's affecting cervids, deer, moose, caribou, elk. And it was being studied at the University of Colorado at Fort Collins. And they had a pen there where they had several animals that were diseased that they were studying. And, of course, as always happens, one of these or two of these ended up getting out. And from there, it started to spread throughout the United States. And right now, there's 22 states that have CWD inside their state, killing animals as we speak. And the scariest thing is, George, is that this is incurable. If the animal gets it, it's dead.
It's gone, yeah.
And the prions pass through the system like if they urinate on a piece of grass, the next animal comes by, it's going to get it if it eats that grass.
Or what if the human eats the animal?
Well, the funny thing is that when you read the different fish and game websites, every one says, get your animal tested before you consume it, but don't worry, it can't pass to humans, but we don't recommend eating it. This is exactly what it says. So would I eat it? Heck no. And would I get it tested? Oh, yes. But the problem is that there's no strategy to deal with this. And the number of counties in each state that have chronic wasting disease is rising incrementally as we speak. And nobody, and I mean nobody, has a strategy on how to deal with it.
You don't hear that much about it. It's bizarre.
And when I give talks, this is one of the things I speak about, is I tell the families of hunters that if you live in a state that has even one case of chronic wasting disease, you'd have to be absolutely nuts not to get that animal tested before.
Oh, my God. They bring it home? Oh.
That's correct. Now, here's the unusual part of this. That chronic wasting disease can be something like chronic...
That's that brain disease, isn't it?
Right. And it mimics Alzheimer's disease to a T. And if somebody who has, say, Alzheimer's or dementia, and you're under a doctor's care for a long time, and you end up dying, the chances are the doctor's not going to do an autopsy on you because you're under your doctor's care. He's just going to sign off the death based on dementia or Alzheimer's. But the symptoms are identical to what the cows did to the people in Great Britain, and there have been a few isolated cases of it here in the United States as well. The implication is that the rate of Alzheimer's and dementia is skyrocketing in the U.S. Now, does this have something to do with CWD? Does it have something to do with mad cow disease in the U.S.? Nobody is talking about it, but the similarities between the two are scary.
David, are you tying in the chronic wasting disease with the UFO situation?
Well, the story I told you earlier about the workers seeing the UFO come down and take this elk away was in an area that had been inundated with CWD. Well, then you go back and you look at the area where the hunter was taken and the other hunters have disappeared. It's an area that's highly infected with chronic wasting disease. And when the alien told the hunter that they came down and took the animals regularly, there was no clarity exactly why they were taking them, but it's almost as though they're monitoring our environment, maybe to see the health of what's around us.
And hence that could be one of the reasons for the cattle mutilations, too, just to do basically autopsies on them.
Possible.
When you were all done with this and you put this documentary together, did you shake your head going, this is crazy?
You know what I did is I sent it to somebody in the UFO world, and I said, tell me I'm nuts. Tell me what you think. And this person is highly involved. Everyone knows their name.
We know them, don't we?
Oh, yes. And this person said, Dave, that is the best UFO movie I've ever seen. You have got to take that to the Academy and get it up for an Academy Award under the documentary section. I swear to you, George, you will see that review in the future. I was stunned. I've never heard anything like it.
Are you still perplexed?
Very much so.
Maybe more so than even before when you started?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason being is that this has given us something to look at that we never had before, but it doesn't answer the questions about why, how much, where, and what's happening to the people that are returned and are deceased, and they can't. Many times, George, the people that come back that they find deceased, they can't determine the cause of death. And that is a true mystery. And that happens a large percentage of the time.
That is strange. Now, you had mentioned on a couple past shows sometimes the clothes is neatly folded and everything and put down by the body on some cases.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And one of the cases that starts the movie off is a hunter who disappeared in British Columbia. And they did a massive search for this man. What they did find is right next to the lake where he was camping, behind a log about a quarter mile from where his campsite was, they found his clothes neatly folded kind of underneath a log. And then on a mountaintop, they found one of his firearms. It was a comprehensive search. And we interviewed the search and rescue coordinator, and he said, Dave, in all my years of doing this, I've never had an RCMP SWAT team show up at a search for a missing person. And that, coupled with the search team being told that they can't go into the woods and search for this man because it was unsearchable. And the search and rescue coordinator said on camera, he said, nothing's unsearchable, Dave. I have no idea why they said that, but they wouldn't let us go into the woods.
How much do you think the law enforcement in these communities, the parks and places like that, know what's going on?
That's a great question, but what I did learn when I was up in Canada is I interviewed an RCMP officer that was retired in this area where this hunter disappeared. And I found out that the RCMP treats a UFO investigation totally different than the way a U.S. treats it. In the RCMP, they're a federal law enforcement agency for Canada. If they get a report of a UFO, they have to take a comprehensive report, investigate it, and then send that report overnight to Ottawa under a top-secret heading. If there's alien seen or if there's any evidence, it gets an incremental bump in Canada to an even higher classification. And I said, this is totally different than the way we handle UFOs in the United States. It's more almost of a joke. And if there is any investigation, they don't tell us.
No.
But in Canada, it's very serious.
Would you say the disappearance of people is just as widespread in Canada as it is in the U.S.?
If not more so.
Equal? Of course, we have more people in the United States.
Correct, but there are a heck of a lot of people missing in Canada. I wrote a book called Missing 411 Canada, and in there's a map of missing people from British Columbia that fit our profile. The numbers are staggering.
Jeez. Has this story gone to the White House?
Kind of, yeah. When I was in Colorado, myself and a professor at one of the universities there got legislation going, and it's in front of Congress right now, to force the National Park Service to put missing people online and categorize them appropriately and put information about their disappearance online. And if you go to any large police department and you look under the missing people, many times their missing people are listed online. Now, the National Park Service doesn't do that. And in fact, they want to charge me $1.4 million for a list of their missing people. And after I wrote, 11 books about missing people, and I found all the people who were missing in Yosemite, all of a sudden they released a list of missing people from Yosemite. But that's all after I already wrote about them all. And they have not released any other lists as of yet.
Most of these disappearances are happening in rural areas, as you pointed out over the years. Are they coming to roost in more congested areas?
Absolutely. I wrote a book called Missing 411, A Sobering Coincidence. And it was a book about young men, young, healthy men, most of them were college age and in college, who disappeared from an urban environment, like a bar, a restaurant, around people. And the people said, yeah, all of a sudden the person just kind of vanished. We lost sight of him, and we don't know where he went. And then the next thing you know, there's a big search. They can't find him, and 3 or 4 days later, they're found in a river, dead. And in many of these cases, the people didn't die of drowning, and they can't figure out why the person did die. And a parent got very concerned because they didn't believe the autopsy was done right. So they had a secondary autopsy done. Well, in a standard autopsy, there's 24 drugs and narcotics that are searched for in the body. Well, there's hundreds of different drugs and narcotics. Well, in this second autopsy, this parent and a coroner did a expanded edition, and they found super high levels of GHB in the body. Now, GHB is considered like the date rape drug, and the body does produce GHB in microelements. And the thing was is that nobody could figure out how this person got GHB in their system, number one, in the astronomical numbers that were inside the body. And if this person, or if a lot of these young men had these levels of GHB in their system and they were placed in water, chances are they couldn't swim their way out of it and they would drown. And many of the cases, they do drown, and the person was a great swimmer. In other cases, they couldn't find the cause of death. One year, Ben, my son, was playing hockey, and a coroner from this large jurisdiction knew I was going to this one city to watch my son play, and they asked to meet. And this coroner said, Dave, what you're writing about and what you talk about, we know about, because it happens in our jurisdictions regularly.
Wow.
And we know as scientists that we should be able to figure out the cause of death, and we can't figure it out. And when you talked about GHB in one of those shows on Coast to Coast, we wish you would come to one of the coroners' conferences and talk about it. And they gave me the name of the conference. They said to apply, and I applied, and I was turned down. They didn't want to hear about it. So
interesting.
So I did a special for the History Channel called Vanished. And in that show, we talked about the disappearance of a man named Dale Startling from Mesa Verde National Park. And he was with his family, and their car broke down. That's why they were at the park. The car was getting fixed. And he just told his wife, hey, I'm going to walk down here and just look at this old village, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Well, he disappeared. The next day, a huge search is going on. Well, a local newspaper reporter was supposed to meet with the national park superintendent that day, and they show up, and the national park superintendent goes, hey, I'm up to my eyeballs in problems with this search. Why don't you go take a hike or something, come back in a couple hours? So this woman goes off and hikes around the park. And as she's out hiking, she doesn't realize it, but she's in the area where this guy disappeared.
Oh, boy.
And she hears somebody calling for help. And she yells back, and he goes, I need help. I'm over here. I need help. Help me. And she hears this 3, 4, 5 times.
But she can't see him.
Can't see him. So she runs 2 miles back to the Park Service office, meets with the superintendent, tells him this story, doesn't even know anyone's missing, and tells the superintendent. And the superintendent looks at the head ranger and says, oh, my God, this is exactly the location yesterday that somebody also heard this person yelling for help. So they send 30 more people out there with canines and everything to search the area. They don't find it.
Jeez.
Make the long story short, later on in this show that I'm doing for history, they send me up to Wisconsin to meet with a physicist named Dr. John Brandenburg. And we're talking about these things. And he said, Dave, you do realize that portals and multi-dimensions, those are real things. And he says, I'm one of a physicist that's on a panel of 8. And he goes, I'm a contract physicist right now for NASA. And we're studying portals. And we're not studying if they're real or not, because everyone believes they are. We're trying to understand how to arm the portal to our advantage. And when I explained what happened in Mesa Verde, he says, well, Dave, maybe the person could see out and see you, but you couldn't see them because they were in a different dimension.
And I think that's probably what's happening. Brandenburg's been on our program before, David, and I didn't know he was that involved in the portals, but isn't that bizarre? They're in that area. And did they ever find this guy?
So they found him years later in an area that had been searched before, leaning deceased under a tree.
That's bizarre. All decomposed, obviously.
Yeah.
Fully clothed?
They didn't release all of the information on that case, and I have never seen a description of what he was found wearing.
Cause of death, did they ever say?
Never did.
David, when you put this documentary together, was there anything that shocked you?
Honestly, George, I think 50% of it was a shock to us.
Wow, that's a lot.
It's a lot. When I originally started out, this wasn't the game plan that we were looking at. It was, like I said earlier, it was almost like we were spoon-fed this information to walk this path, and it was so intriguing, and the witnesses were so credible, and the facts were there that you had to follow it. I mean, all the way from the elk abduction to the chronic wasting disease to the German hunters to the UFOs, it was all there. Over time, I mean, you've heard from witnesses and people who come out and they say, yeah, you know, the government's doing this type of work. Well, if you study the government, they've done a lot of things to the citizenry that was reprehensible.
Yes, that's true.
When you look at that craft that was over the hunters in Idaho, there's some thought that that craft may even be a secret aircraft belonging to our government.
David, 60 years ago, Rod Serling put together a program on Twilight Zone called Little Girl Lost, about a portal that was by her bed in her bedroom. 60 years ago, he was talking about portals, and we're just finding out about them again. It's amazing, isn't it?
It is that they knew that back then, and they really kept it hidden from us. When people hear that, okay, somebody credible is talking about this, and I've validated that a lot of these witnesses are super credible, then all of a sudden people start to come out and say, hey, I'm not alone. I feel I can talk about this. And it's overwhelming how many this has happened to.
If you had to give it a percent, UFO abductions as the number one thing that was happening to people, what would you put the percent at?
In the ones described in this movie, 100%.
That's huge. This book was a scary, scary book, and I didn't know it went all the way back to the late 1800s, but how did you key in on Montana, David?
Well, years ago when I was just doing the general research and going through archives of various states, I kept coming back to Montana on several cases. And then about a year ago, I moved here, and I thought, well, this would be a pretty easy role for me. Since I'm here, I could kind of go to the locations, get an understanding of where these people disappeared, maybe do some videos, which I did do for our online page. And the more I got into it, the more I understood that there was really something unusual about the state. Specifically, the biggest cluster in the state is Glacier National Park, and Glacier has some of the most interesting cases of them all.
How did you track this back to the late 1800s?
So that wasn't so easy, yeah. Archive work is slow, patient, methodical. You got to be persistent. You got to kind of just look through thousands and thousands of articles and keep weaving your way through, and sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. But as I've stated about 50 times on your show, the National Park Service is not a cooperative entity on this.
Right. They're holding back on you. They
are, and they're still holding back. And they've claimed that they don't keep a list of missing people. And your brother in arms over there, George Knapp, in one of our documentaries, came right out and said, oh, they're lying to you, Dave. They have a list. They don't want you to see it for some reason. And about the time that we started to have that pushback from them, I just started pushing harder and then said, well, if they're not going to give me a list, I'll try to dig up all the cases I can. And there's no doubt that I haven't found them. But I did find something really interesting, is the National Park Service has a classification called missing and presumed dead. And when they give a case that classification, all of a sudden they're not on the missing person list anymore, if there is one. And in some parks, the press information officer has given me a list from that specific park. But because of that classification, you can't trust it, because, say, some of the cases that I found in the early 1900s, they're not listed as missing anymore. They're presumed dead.
Yep, because of the length of time and everything else.
Right.
And in these cases in Montana, we're talking about 68 people in just the Glacier Park area or the entire state?
The entire state. Some of the cases are in the Yellowstone area, some of them around Glacier, some of them throughout some of the Crazy Mountains and other mountain ranges in the state. And there's a series of clusters that occupy Montana where there's 3 or more missing cases within a small confined area. And the research there that we found goes from 1896 to 2014.
Of those that are found, how many are found alive or none?
So that's very rare that you find somebody alive. But 44 of the victims were never found. 24 of the victims were found. And a great many of them that were found were not found alive. Now, the ones that were found alive, some of them were so small. Case, I can talk to you about it later, that a small girl disappeared. She was 2 years old. She has no recollection of what happened when she was 2.
No, of course not. Those that are found dead, what are the causes?
So there's a mixed bag there. A lot of the cases that I work, the coroners cannot determine a cause of death. And that's unusual because coroners are scientific people and they all believe that they can find the cause. And when they can't, they know something's up. And during 10 years of doing this, I spoke to several coroners who have stated that they know something unusual is happening. And they talk about it amongst their team all the time, but they can't understand why they can't determine a cause of death. I've had people tell me from the religious arena that these people that die and they can't determine a cause of death, something has stolen their soul.
Jeez. It's a bizarre situation.
Now, the National Park Service is broken into a couple different parts as far as law enforcement. They have the frontline uniformed officers that you see driving around with guns that patrol the park in uniform. And they also have what's called special agents. Now, Yosemite is the head of special agents for their Pacific Division. And my guess is they probably have 6 to 9 special agents working out of that Yosemite office. And they are the detectives. And they have more advanced training. They're considered special agents. They travel around. They do all the follow-up work on major cases. And when they have a really big case, they call in the FBI. And I've written about cases where people have disappeared and all of a sudden the FBI shows up. But there's one problem with that. The FBI says that they don't investigate missing people unless it's a small child under specific circumstances.
Right.
But the cases I've written about involve adults. So why is the FBI showing up on missing person cases involving adults? And that's been a conundrum for a long time.
Now, of these missing people, David, that show up dead, are any of them from causes that we would assume, stabbings, gunshot wounds, or anything like that?
No, anything criminal related that can prove to be criminal, I won't work it.
You don't do it. Okay. So these cases we're talking about and we'll talk about tonight, these are the bizarre ones.
These are the ones that are really unexplained.
Gosh.
And a lot of people don't even like to address them because it puts the rank and file special agents in a weird position having to talk about something that they're uncomfortable with. But it's those cases that really I've come to write about at length. Another thing that we vet out is animal attacks, animal predation.
Mm-hmm.
If there's any evidence of that, we won't work it. And people say, well, how do you know? Well, people fight for their lives when they're attacked by an animal.
That's right. And other people hear the screams of the animal and the person.
Oh, yeah. There'll be a big scene. There'll be blood, torn clothing, drag marks, etc. And on the cases that I present, there's none of that. And I tell this at every conference I'm at. I ask the audience, I said, well, how many fatal mountain lion attacks do you think there have been in North America in the last 100 years? And I get answers, all the way up to 200, 300. There's only been 18. And if you really think about that, 18 fatal mountain lion attacks in over 100 years in North America, that is not many.
That is not many. Is there something, in your opinion, when we have to weigh the possibilities, supernatural happening here as opposed to something natural that we just can't explain?
That's a good question. And I'm sure there's people out there that are a lot more expert in those areas than I am. I mean, I think I'm pretty acutely aware of the facts surrounding the cases and doing the investigation. But like a person, say, Richard Dolan, he may be an expert in the supernatural or UFOs.
Right.
And so I would defer to those guys on maybe they know something more than I know, because I can say that there's tens of thousands of people, George, that have read my books, and I've never had anybody that read all of the books and said, I know what's happening.
Right. It's baffling. What really baffles me, David, are the cases where people disappear and they're just several feet away from other people and nobody sees them gone. They just disappear.
Doesn't make sense.
It's crazy. They don't hear screams. They don't hear, it's not like somebody came down from a tree like Tarzan, swooped up and took them. Nobody hears anything.
One of the things that people say is, well, maybe it's a giant bird that takes these little kids and nobody hears and sees anything. And I said, now, if a little kid was grabbed by a big bird,
you're going to hear a scream.
You're going to hear a scream, and they're going to have giant talon marks in their shoulders and neck and head from getting grabbed and picked up. But in all the cases I've ever worked, I've never heard of that. No marks on the body at all.
And you'll probably hear the screaming from the bird, too.
Yes, it flies over.
David, many hikers, many hunters out there, you've got some recommendations for them to help them, even though whatever's happening, I think, could be bizarrely supernatural. But what are your tips for them?
So, George, I gave a presentation several years ago in front of the largest search and rescue organization in the world. It's called NASAR. And during that presentation, I talked about some things that maybe they don't even think about. But one thing that every hiker, hunter, anyone who goes in the woods, and specifically anyone who goes off trail, should be carrying what's called a personal locator beacon. And you can buy them on Amazon. There's no subscription fee. It's a small device about the size of a cell phone, and when you activate it, it sends a message up to a satellite. That satellite shoots it down to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration that someone's in distress. They call the nearest search and rescue organization, and they can find you within 10 feet.
Wow. Yeah.
And I'm amazed at the number of people that have never heard of these. And I've said at conferences before, if people had these, 90% of the cases that I work would not exist. In carrying items, you always want to carry some energy bars, a small little emergency blanket. It costs about $6. It's about the size of your fist. It almost weighs nothing, but it will insulate you in case there's bad weather.
Mm-hmm. Flashlight,
mirror, whistle, and a fire starter. And this is pretty funny. But on my YouTube channel, which is called the Can-Am Missing Project, I have about 90 videos, and I made a video about dryer lint. And it's a funny, you giggle about that. But if you take some lint out of your dryer and you stuff it in, say, a prescription bottle and just throw it in your backpack, that lint will start a fire for you every time. And if you soak the lint in Vaseline, it even burns quicker, hotter, and faster. So I always tell people that it's kind of a little unknown thing, but dryer lint. Another thing is I was trained in law enforcement, so I look at firearms as a tool, and I would encourage anybody to get advanced training with that tool, a pistol, and carry it. And people say, well, why? Well, first of all, it's well used to attract attention. 3 gunshots in a row indicate to anyone who knows that that's somebody in distress and they need to be saved.
That's right.
And a statistic that I found that I've never had disproven is I've never found a case of somebody missing that was carrying a firearm and a personal locator beacon. Now, just a beacon? Yes. Just a firearm? I wrote a whole book about them called Missing 411 Hunters. But both? Never.
Good. Those are good tips, and, they're practical.
Well, I think they're pretty easy. I think most of the time people don't tell somebody where they're going when they leave. Sometimes if you go off trail and you haven't told anyone where you're going, when you're going to be back, and you break your leg off trail, there's a good chance you're going to die right there. Now, a little funny story is I was in Australia on a book tour, and while we were filming in a national park, Angie and I were walking down a trail, and it had just rained, and it was just us in the middle of nowhere. And I go over this boulder, and I'm carrying a big camera rig, and as we go over the boulder, I hear this, I lean back, and I don't want to drop the camera, so I don't, and I make an awkward move, and I hear a loud crack, and I fall. And I think, oh, my God. And Angie looks at me. She's a nurse. And she goes, oh, that didn't sound good. So I push myself up with my left leg, and I just gently put my right leg down, and there was something really wrong. And it blew up like, a melon.
Oh, jeez.
And she's a small little thing, and I just hobbled out of there. And we got to the hotel later. I hobbled about 2 miles. And I got to the hotel, and she goes, you either blew all the tendons in that leg and that ankle, or you broke it. Well, I made it through the whole trip, and I get back to the doctor in Colorado.
Black and blue, by the way?
Oh, it was huge, yeah. It was gross.
Yeah.
And the doctor goes, well, we know you didn't break it because you've been hobbling around on it for 2 weeks. But, maybe we ought to take an x-ray. Well, it turns out I did break it. And it was just the way it broke. It kind of stayed together enough that I could put a little bit of weight on it, and I made it 2 weeks. But if you completely break your tib fib, you're not going to put any weight on it, and there's a good chance you'll die there if nobody knows where you're at.
David, tell us about some of the similarities of the missing. Is there a common denominator here or a series of common denominators?
So if you look at, say, 10 cases of missing people, you're not going to learn a lot. But I started to look at hundreds and then thousands of cases. And when I started to get these cases, I started to read that certain things kept popping up that were unusual to me. And I worked on a SWAT team for a big city, and we had the canines attached to us. And I know that the dogs, when we put them on a track with somebody, they would find that person 100% of the time. They were infallible. But I was seeing and reading cases where search and rescue brought in dogs, and the dogs weren't finding people. And I put all of those reports in a big pile. And then I found another big stack of reports where they brought in professional trackers and they couldn't find tracks. And there was another pile where if the victim was found, they didn't have any memory of how they got lost or where they went or how they were found. Another pile was a weather event, meaning just after the person disappeared or just before, there was some major weather event that hindered the search. Another one is missing clothes or shoes. Now, some people will say, oh, that was a hypothermia-related case. Maybe, but probably not.
Who would take their shoes off in a situation like that?
Well, plus, these things were found within, say, 100 yards of where the person disappeared, so there was no time for hypothermia to set in. One of the other ones was, and this one was a real peculiar one, is that the victims, dead or alive, were found in an area that had been previously searched maybe 20 times. And then all of a sudden they pop up there.
They pop up. How could you miss that?
Well, in one incident I've talked about on your show before, in the Sierras, search and rescue walked the same trail every day for a week. The eighth day they walk out the trail and there's a tree that fell across the trail, and laying on top of the tree was this dead body.
Jeez.
And then another big one is called point of separation. And this one makes you think that somehow or another these people are being watched, and that once they separate on the trail, say a couple of hunters, and one hunter says, I'm going to go to the ridge to the right, another one says he's going to the ridge to the left.
Right.
Something happens then. And I have maybe 10 cases out of thousands where two people disappeared and were found deceased at the same time, but it almost never happens. And one, this point of separation, one's found alive, one's never found. Another one like we've already talked about is unknown cause of death, and then cluster zones. In North America, there are 74 cluster zones of missing people. The largest cluster zone in the world is Yosemite National Park and that periphery around the park. And in those cluster zones, you have cases that match the profile points I just talked about. Now, another thing, George, that a lot of people in the woods talk about just prior to something super unusual happening, this has happened to me once, is that all of a sudden the forest just goes completely silent.
That's weird.
Yeah, and I was maybe 3 or 4 years into this research, and I was up in the middle of nowhere in Northern California, and I was hiking with a man who was about 75 years old, lived in the woods half his life. I mean, he knew everything. We're walking through the woods, and then all of a sudden, we both stopped and looked at each other and goes, Dave, you realize what just happened? I said, yeah, there's no birds, there's no sound of...
No insects, nothing.
No trees rustling, no wind. And so we said, okay, we're going to go sit on the other side of this tree. You're going to sit one way, I'm going to sit the other, kind of watch each other's back. After about 20 minutes, the sound came back, and just like you said, insects started making noise. Now, since then, at MUFON conferences, people have read my books, and they said, Dave, some people believe that when this happens, there's a portal that opens and envelops all of the sound, and that's why you don't hear it. I don't know, but that's what somebody said.
It is just a weird circumstance, and it's in your blood now. You've got to get an answer for yourself, don't you? Here are the possibilities that keep coming out. Beamed aboard UFOs. Some of these might seem strange. Bigfoot grabs them. There's a portal out there. Animals grab them. There's serial killers out there. There's all kinds of possibilities, but they don't. The natural ones don't make sense.
Well, I could take one for you right away. Let's talk about serial killers. To confront somebody in the woods and to abduct them is a very dangerous task because a lot of people in the woods are carrying guns.
And you just don't know.
You just don't know. And I know a lot of females in the woods carry guns. And there's very few females in my work that are taken versus male. It's almost like a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio. And if a serial killer took somebody, for anyone who knows anything about men, women carrying things, it's not easy to carry a body out. And then how do you dispose of it so the canines that are brought in and cadaver dogs don't ever find it?
Exactly.
And how are you going to force somebody down a trail if they don't want to go? If you shoot them, you're going to leave a lot of evidence and they're going to be found. But if you can force them to go, well, yeah, that might be good, but you're going to leave tracks. And those tracks and those scent trails aren't found.
Give us a few of these Montana cases, if you would, David. We can't go through all 68, obviously, but pick a couple that really fascinate you.
Okay. I did a documentary called Missing 411, The Hunted. In there, we chronicled a case involving a man named Aaron Hedges. And Aaron disappeared September 7th, 2014 in the Crazy Mountains, about 15 miles north of Big Timber. Guy knew the woods like you and I know our own neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
He'd been there many times. And he'd stashed supplies in certain portions of the woods, which hunters do. And he entered the Crazies from the western side on the Cottonwood Lake trailhead. And he was archery hunting, and his 2 other buddies were rifle hunting. And they used mules to pack their stuff in. The first odd thing that happened was as they were going in with their mules, something spooked the mules, and they ran off, and Hedges lost a lot of his supplies, which wasn't a big deal because he had other supplies cached.
Okay.
All these guys are carrying radios, handheld radios, so they could keep in communication. Now, he radioed his friends after they got inside of the Crazy Mountains that he was going to go to a place called Sunlight Lake, and he was going to grab some sleeping bags and some food. Well, and he said he'd be back. Well, he never arrived back. And they weren't worried about him because he was a very rugged guy. He knew the wilderness back of his hand.
Does his own thing.
Does his own thing, exactly. And a lot of hunters are that way because they like to hunt alone. And so they thought maybe he was onto an elk. Well, some friends had tried to raise him on the radio the next day and still didn't, and still weren't that worried. And they went off, and his buddies found some elk, shot it. Make a very long story short, there was a delay there of several days until his friends got outside the wilderness and were able to get a hold of the Park County Sheriff. And the sheriff eventually got there a day later and came into the Crazies from the west side. And right in the middle of the Crazy Mountains is the borderline between Park and Sweetgrass County. Now, as Sweetgrass County comes in from the east going west, they find a water bladder and a filter and Aaron's boots sitting next to a fire pit with 18 inches of snow around him. Now, he didn't have a tent that they found, but they've got his boots now, they have a water bladder, and they have a water filter. And there's snow around the spot where they found these things.
But no Aaron.
No Aaron. The SAR commander says, and this is now the sheriff of Sweetgrass County, and he says, Dave, we told ourselves, his body's within 100 yards. He has hypothermia, and he's dead. He's got to be. With all the snow on the ground, he can't go far in bare feet.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're calling in a National Guard helicopter, and they've got FLIR looking for him, and they've got canines now that are looking for tracks in the snow. Here we go again. No tracks in the snow. No scent trail. No nothing. Well, they search for 2 weeks. They don't find him. They pull out.
Sometimes I can't sleep after I've interviewed you. You got me all riled up with this stuff.
Well, George, that makes 2 of us. I mean, there's many nights where I'll go through a case and I'll go lay in bed and just gather my thoughts, and sometimes my thoughts are out there with the people in the woods that have disappeared, and it's not a comforting feeling.
Oh, my gosh, it really is. So what is new in the field of these missing people?
Well, about 2 or 3 years ago, when I was in the middle of investigating rural disappearances, several people came to me and they said, I know that you're one of those people out there that keeps an open mind and you keeps your spectrum open, but one of these days you're going to move from the woods, those rural areas, and you're going to come into the city because the profile points that you've identified on these cases, they're going to transition. You are just going to find it. It's just going to be a matter of time. Truth of the matter is I was so occupied with looking at people who have disappeared in the national parks and forests in North America that I was probably a bit taken by that statement, and I kept my mind open, and some things came along, and some people sent me some emails, and sooner or later I got to the point where I was looking at cases of college-aged men that disappeared under unusual conditions, predominantly in the Great Lakes region, but also along the East Coast area of the U.S. And there were some common denominators there that also reflected upon the disappearances we were looking at in rural areas. And after studying that for a year, a few months back, I came out with a 5th book called Missing 411, A Sobering Coincidence. And the factors on that is that canines can't track the people to where they disappeared. They almost seem to disappear under the noses of their friends and family. Many, many times there's alcohol involved, and many, many times they're found in an area that had been searched sometimes 10 times. And this is the same profile points that happen in the rural disappearances.
Just amazing.
Now, one of the weird things is that many times when these people are found, the search and rescue people are never thinking criminal act. They're always thinking, my gosh, we found somebody, whether they're dead or alive, we found them and we can get closure. And they're not trained investigators, and usually when they're found, the body's turned over to the coroner. Yeah, they died in the woods, and that would be the end of it. Now, with cases in the water, it brings home an entirely different perspective on the way the body reacts to water, and there's certain things that the body does in certain periods of time in the water that it doesn't do on land, and they're readily identifiable. And after looking at a series of cases where there were secondary autopsies, and in some cases where the original medical examiner was honest and would face the consequences, say the person disappeared 7 days ago, the coroner would come out and say, well, they might have disappeared 7 days ago, but they've only been in the water for 2 days.
Huh.
And, George, this doesn't happen once or twice. This has happened many times.
Over and over again, too.
And then, on top of that, many times the coroner comes back and says, yeah, we can't determine what caused the death of these people. And this has happened also in these rural disappearances. And when you try to stay confined to certain points that you've identified and you don't want to wander, then it excludes a lot of perimeter cases that we might have looked at, but the reality of it is that we're trying to stay to that straight criteria. Now, some other detectives were working on something similar to this, and they used the cases and they identified them as the smiley face killers. And they claimed that in certain instances they would find some graffiti next to the site where the people were found. And these guys, a guy named Gannon, who's retired from New York police, I give the guy a lot of credit because most detectives don't want to work missing persons cases. They want to work homicide cases, robbery, homicide, etc.
Right.
But I tell you, Gannon from New York, he really paid attention to what was happening to these people in the Hudson River and in other rivers around that New York area. And he determined that certain bodies couldn't have ended up in locations where they did. He worked with coroners to figure out that the bodies weren't in the rivers as long as they were. And these guys were looking at it from a local area perspective. And when I looked at it, I knew that I had cases in rural areas that were not only in the United States and Canada, but they were also in 7 other countries that exactly met this established profile. Well, I knew that if the profile went to these young men that were disappearing in these rivers, then it also probably was happening in other areas of the world.
Jeez.
And the one other area right now where everyone could go to if they're near a computer is go and Google canal deaths in Manchester, UK. And what's happened is there's been 61 deaths of young men in Manchester where many times the police can't determine the cause of death. They've thought if it was a serial killer, they'd be able to identify it, but they're saying that it's not a serial killer. And the most amazing statement is that they're saying that none of these cases have anything in common to bring them to focus, but they're just random acts, even though it's been 61 people that have died in 9 years.
And they can't tie any of them together.
I don't think they want to.
That's scary.
That is scary. And if you look at the facts surrounding those deaths, no one ever sees these guys going in the water. There's never been a suspect. Many times they can't determine the cause of death. It's these young men are walking home from a pub or a bar, they disappear. But they're disappearing in canals where sometimes the water's only a few feet deep, and they're found in the water deceased.
And they can't figure out how they die?
That happens in many cases in the UK. It's happened in many, many cases in the U.S.
What about the cases that are happening around British Columbia, Canada, where feet are showing up on shore? Just feet. They're not finding bodies, but feet.
You know, we looked at that because in the part of the profile points that we've identified is that people are missing shoes and clothing many times when they disappear. And then we started looking at these feet, and some of them have been found on the Northern California coast, and some have been found on lakes and things in North America and in British Columbia. Now, there's an entire series of these in the Vancouver area where they haven't been able to identify anybody. And they've got DNA, and they have the shoe, and they have the foot, but they can't really talk much more about it because some coroners have claimed that the foot comes off first if they're in the water a long period of time, but they should be able to put that foot with a missing person if they have the DNA.
You would think so.
You bring up the point about British Columbia, and I get questions all the time from Canada, and I know that there's a lot of people from there listening right now. In the area of lower British Columbia, in that northern Vancouver area, there are so many people that have disappeared. And I've got a couple friends that live in that area, and they tell me all the time, hey, there's people disappearing up here. And the news does the same thing here as they do in the States. They report it for the first couple days, maybe up to 4 or 5 days, but then you never hear about it.
Then they stop. Then they go on to the next tragedy.
Exactly. And why are these people disappearing? How are they disappearing? And if they're found, what are the circumstances? And you really don't hear a lot about it. 99% of the time, these people are hiking alone. They get ahead of the group. They're behind the group. One way or another, they aren't seen when they disappear, and they're usually found in areas that baffle the investigators. And it doesn't matter if it's a Canadian or a U.S. search and rescue person. Sometimes when they get on the media, they're stumped. They can't answer the question how the person got to where they were found.
Of these people who are found, do they still have blood in their bodies? Interesting question. I never asked you that.
So there are a few unusual cases. It's called exsanguination, where some bodies are found and there's no blood in them. And I've written about that in some of my books, and it's really unusual. It's not a common trait. And in my last book, I wrote about a woman that disappeared, and that they had that issue, and they couldn't find enough blood to do tests on her in the body. And the unusual part of that is that they couldn't find any wounds on the body that would account for the loss of blood.
David, I'm going to go through some cases with you and have you update us on some people with basically a list of these people. But this is shocking. This isn't getting solved, is it?
Well, you know what I tell people is when I give a presentation, to me it's like spokes in a wheel. And I started off with just one or two spokes. This missing young men in urban areas. Mm-hmm. This is another spoke in the wheel. And I've got a feeling the spokes are going to increase before we really solve this.
And when the inner city disappearances, what percent of those are found dead?
99%.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it's a very scary, high profile. There's only one case I know of where somebody disappeared and was found
All
alive.
right. Neville Jewell from British Columbia.
So this kind of brings on a story about a very experienced hiker. He's on the Howcrest Trail near Cypress Mountain in northern Vancouver area. Parked his car on this trail, started walking. He texted his girlfriend at 2 o'clock, said he was going to be home on time. He was in the West Lyon area. Didn't show up, didn't come back. They started a search right away. They pulled his cell phone forensics, and it kind of was showing some activity in a specific area, in a specific ridge line of in the Capilano watershed. And for people who have been to northern Vancouver before, there's a famous Capilano suspension bridge, and that's in this area. They brought search dogs in. They never found a scent. Bad weather hit the area immediately after the search started. Another profile point. The other profile point being is that when canines can't find a scent in an area for the victim, that's something we pay attention to. Make a long story short, this happened September 12th, 2015. They gave up the search, and Neville Jewell has never been found. The people here that we're talking about, no mental illness issues, in happy relationships, non-suicidal. If they were suicidal, if there was sign of human predation, if there was sign of animal predation, that would eliminate it from our research.
Next up, Tom Billings. Tell us about Tom.
This is another tough one, 22 years old, in the same area as Neville. Trail runners said that they saw Billings just before he started to hike in the area of Lynn Canyon in the same general area. Well, scent dogs that were brought up into that area, they found nothing, even though the searchers had people that put him in a specific place. After that, they found nothing. This is in an area of Grouse Mountain, again in that Capilano area. He left his cell phone in his room because it was broken. He left his room at 9 a.m. that morning, telling roommates he'd be back by 9:45 that night. He discussed hiking this area of Grouse Mountain with his roommate. He was an extremely experienced hiker, and he had made big trips to Russia, Siberia, Belarus, Latvia, Israel. It's a lengthy list. This guy was well known in the hiking circles, and it was confusing to friends and his father why he had tried to leave and make a hike on a mountain when he finally started at that base at about 2 p.m. He knew better than to do this, so it was confusing to him why he did. And a massive, massive search was inhibited by bad weather, and it was also inhibited by the fact they never found a scent in the area where they knew he was going to be. So we have two hikers now that have disappeared in the same area with the same profile points. Both have never been found.
How did these stories come to you? Do people share them now? Insiders?
It's unbelievable now, after doing this for a number of years, how many emails I get from people saying, you know, you really ought to look at this area, or you really ought to look at this case. And I will tell people, because it's funny, they hear you and I having a conversation, and maybe they've listened to 3 or 4 of our interviews, and they think that they understand what is happening here. And I can tell you that in all the interviews I've ever done, maybe 4 or 5% of all the facts and elements have come out in these 100 hours of interviews. But all the minutia of the facts is in the books, and that's really the meat of the issue.
That's right.
It's these little things where, like you said, he left his cell phone in his room. In a lot of the cases that we write about, the people didn't have any transmission with them. They didn't have a sat phone. They didn't have a cell phone. They didn't have an emergency transponder beacon that we tell people to carry. And for whatever reason, it seems to be more the norm than not.
David Koch, tell me his story.
Well, this one's a tough one. 36 years old. He disappeared May 25th, 2005, in the exact, and I'm talking the exact same area that Tom Billings disappeared 8 years later. He was an associate publisher and sales manager for a magazine called DM Review. It's an IT magazine. He's on a business trip to Vancouver, had a wife, and had talked about going up to Vancouver and being able to take these outdoor trips because he was an enthusiast of the outdoors. He took a trip to Grouse Mountain. He told his wife he was going there, and he was on one of the last trams to go up to the top of the mountain. It was about 7:30, 8 o'clock. He rode up there with 25 other people. It was all on videotape. He's wearing sandals, a T-shirt, and shorts. It was beautiful weather. And when he got to the top, showed him getting off the tram, and he walked over towards an atrium for a couple minutes, caught him on CCTV going back to the visitor's booth and or to the bathroom. Within a couple of minutes, the TV didn't see him anymore, and he disappeared. Everything at that top of that mountain was open until 10 o'clock, and it was normal for people to go up there at that hours after work. Immediately after David disappears, the weather changes. The headlines for the paper in Canada were, "Weather hinders search for Heartland man missing in Canada."
That happens a lot, too, doesn't it? The weather just quickly changes.
Exactly. And they looked for him intensively for 10 days. 400 rescuers, multiple helicopters with FLIR, multiple bloodhound teams, in addition to hundreds of volunteer searchers. And it stated that it rained almost nonstop for the next 5 days from the time he disappeared. Now, fast forward, and he disappears on May 25th. June 7th, in an area 2,100 feet off of one of the trails on the mountain, in a pool of water, they found him deceased. Now, that area had been searched multiple times, and the searchers said they were confused that he was found there. Now, this is the part, and it goes back to the missing men who had been drinking in and were found in rivers. This is one of those cases that it's a dead-on match. The autopsy said that he died of hypothermia, but the medical examiner stated he went missing on May 25th, but Mr. Koch died 6 days later on May 31st. So where was he?
Where did he go for those days?
And end up right in the area in the middle of searching. Now, just for food for thought, he was also of German heritage. Things to think about. Where he was found was not where he perished, number one. There were no tracks going in and out of that area. Searchers specifically stated they found no broken branches, no clothing or threads of clothing in the area that they had searched and where he was found. And they said that this was the largest search in 10 years in that area.
It's almost as if, David, they go through some kind of dimension or some kind of door, and they come back later as if they find their way back in. It's weird.
A lot of people have told me that exact thing, George. Or some people use the word portal.
Yeah.
And other people have said, but you know what's confusing is that what were they doing during the days that they were missing and alive?
Exactly. If anything.
Yeah.
Were they suspended in some kind of animation? Who knows?
Well, what I'd be interested in, but many times the medical examiner won't release this part of the autopsy, is I'm interested in what were the stomach contents that they found.
Mm-hmm. Good point. You had told us a story on one of your last appearances of a little boy who was way out in front of his parents, and he came across a couple other hunters, and they were almost concerned, what's this little boy doing out here by themselves? Remember that one?
That was a Jared Adadero case in the late 1990s, northern Colorado. And his parents owned a resort along the Poudre River, and they were hosting a singles group from Denver. And just down the road a little bit, there was a fish pond and an area where the state raised fish. And the singles group said, hey, can we take one of your kids down there because they want to just look at the fish? And he said, sure. And then the little boy, Jared, 3 years old at the time, said, yeah, I want to go, Dad, I want to go. And he says, oh, and a couple of the singles people said, yeah, we'll take care of him. So they take him over to the fish hatchery. Well, unbeknownst to Mr. Adadero, is these single people decided that they weren't going just to the fish hatchery, but they were going to drive up 8 more miles up the road and start walking this wilderness trail. It's called the Poudrehead Trailhead, Big South Trail. And without permission, they took his daughter and the son, and some group decided not to watch the boy anymore, and he started walking on the trail. And he got way ahead of everybody. And he walks up to these two fishermen along the Poudre in a wilderness zone. And he says, hey, are there any bear around here? And the fishermen are obnoxious, and they say, no, there's no bear around here. You know, you're bothering the fish. Leave us alone. And what's unbelievable to me, being a dad, and I know it would be to you too, is these fishermen don't say, hey, you sit down right here, and you wait for your friends or whoever's watching
right.
you.
Exactly.
But you're not going to walk away in some wilderness trail with let a 3-year-old walk away, but they did. And that was the last time anybody ever saw that boy alive. And Alan Adadero, the dad, and I are good friends now, and he's a great guy, and he can't get over what happened to his son, because 750 feet above that trail and down a long ways, 4 years later, they found the skull cap of the boy and a few small bones. They found his pants turned inside out, and they found his shirt almost completely intact. And the Colorado Bureau of Investigation got a hold of the clothing, and they couldn't find any blood on any of the clothing. And some mountain lion experts stated that a mountain lion didn't kill your son because of the way that there's no blood and the clothing isn't torn up.
Right.
And it's a complete whodunit. I don't know anybody that really knows what happened to that boy, because my son and I took the trip, and it was almost straight up from the side of that trail to where Jared's bones and his remains were found. One of the toughest hikes I've ever done. And to think that even somebody found that location 4 years later is unreal.
The German connection with so many of these people being of German descent, is that new? Did you just uncover that, or has that been ongoing?
You know, it might be that maybe I'm a slow learner and it comes to me slower than some, but after a while, when you start seeing the same sort of names, and when descent of a person is talked about in an obituary, German comes up more than normal. So for the last 2 years, I've been paying real close attention to this. And I'll just talk about this summer. A man named Morgan Heimer, 22 years old, was a tour guide in a group of people along the Colorado River in Grand Canyon National Park. They were a couple days into their trip, and they pulled to the side 2 large boats of people, and they take this side trip up this creek. And the people go way up the creek, maybe a mile or so with their guides, and there's a big pool and a waterfall, and they kind of hang out. And the creek's not even deep enough to drown in, per se. You know, you could walk across it ankle deep. But Heimer was in the back of the line when they were coming back on this creek excursion. He was wearing a life preserver, and he disappeared. And Morgan was a student at the University of Wyoming, and I can tell you that this shook up this tour group immensely. Somebody in that group heard about our work, and he called me and he talked to me extensively about this and said, Dave, there was no place for Morgan to go. If he fell in the creek, he wasn't going anywhere. The sides of that canyon were straight up and down. And he was walking, and he was within a quarter mile of both boats and 30 people when he was walking. And nobody can believe he didn't make it back, because they all thought he was right behind them. So they brought in a huge amount of searchers from the National Park Service, volunteers from the tour group. They searched that area for a week. They didn't find one trace of Morgan Heimer. Again, German descent.
Baffling. I mean, what does law enforcement tell you, David? And I'm sure it's not confidential. What do they think's going on?
Well, when I gave that talk in front of NASA in 2012, and I gave the talk just like I'm talking to you now, I wasn't holding anything back, and at the end of it, there were 3 Alaska State Troopers there, and Alaska State Troopers are in charge of all search and rescue in Alaska. And one in their group stood up, and he said, Dave, you're saying something that everybody in this group, that if they've been involved in search and rescue for a long period of time, they know is truthful. But nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to admit it's happening, and they want to analyze it away as just, well, that's unfortunate, or the dogs didn't want to search, or the person must have done something stupid to disappear. But he said, you know what? There's something else here, and people are going to have to wake up and listen to what you're saying. At the end of the talk, there was a line out the door of these searchers that wanted to tell their story of unusual things that people don't want to talk about. There were a series of DNA tests that were completed by other people on suspected Bigfoot, Sasquatch hair. And the reality of those is they all came back as human. And those were mitochondrial tests. And each time that those tests came back as human, the researchers and the lab personnel would say that the tests were compromised by contamination. We think the reason for that is that if you look at the Bigfoot world, every researcher going back in time for the first 30 or 40 years believed Bigfoot was an ape or a gorilla along the lines of something called Gigantopithecus. And for some reason, all of these researchers refused to listen to Native American and First Nations people who all state it's a human. It has a language. They trade with them sometimes. They're people. They're a type of people. They're different, and they have certain abilities that most people don't have, but they're different, but they're people. Well, everyone seemed to ignore that, and everyone seemed to ignore the DNA results that came through. And so we developed a mission statement as an organization that we were going to start, and we were going to complete this, and we were going to go through the end. And one of the first things that came through was I was in Hoopa, and there was a sighting of a Bigfoot at a house in Hoopa, kind of going through the garbage. The female there called the police. The police responded, and essentially there was hair left that was pulled off the Bigfoot as it was reaching over a metal containment area where the garbage was at. And when that hair is pulled out of people, there are little sacs at the end of your hair that contain the DNA that really is useful with hair. And in Bigfoot hair, if you just have the hair itself without the follicle, the DNA inside the hair shaft is so fragmented, it looks nothing like human DNA inside of a shaft. It goes for a few segments, it'll stop. It goes for a few segments, it'll stop. But the hair itself has a unique look that to a hair and fiber analyst, somebody who testifies in court that they can identify hair from different species, animals, people, etc., it has a distinct, unique look only to itself. And if you put it next to 50, 60, 100 different types of hair, that hair and fiber analyst could pick that out as Bigfoot hair every time. So that was one of the screening mechanisms that we used at the very beginning to determine what we were going to study, how far it would go in the gene test, etc. We ended up getting dozens and dozens of samples along with other types of samples, and Dr. Ketchum did something that no other scientist has done in this DNA testing process, and that is she was able to unlock a method to get to the DNA itself and to figure out how to test for it. It was a very complicated process. Everyone else seemed to give up or think that it was just contaminated. In reality, all those other tests that people did, they probably were not contaminated, but the roadblocks and the time-consuming method to get to those issues were so great that everyone just quit. Ketchum continued. And she was probably pushed along by myself and a few others who knew what we had, knew the samples were valid, they were good, they were unique, and the hair and fiber analysts had cleared them and said, no, these are the real deal. And finally, as we get down to the end, and in the releases just the last couple of days, she stated that these are very unique Homo sapiens-type samples, meaning they're modern human. They aren't ancient human. They're within the last 15,000 years, meaning that the evolution of their genetic profile is within that last 15,000 years. But the real unique thing, and the thing that kind of has everybody aghast, is that through the DNA you can know, because of something called GenBank, you can know where the male comes from and where the female comes from going back in your lineage. So say for me, I know that my dad came from Greece and my mom came from Russia. And you can find that in everyone's DNA. Well, in this, we can tell where the mother came from in all of these samples, but the origin of the male is nowhere in the billions of documented DNA ever seen. Now, there's a nasty rumor going around the world that in the paper it says this is angel DNA, and nowhere in the paper does it say that. I can guarantee that. There's competing groups that have started within just the last year, saying that they were going to come out with results quickly, et cetera, et cetera. But really the value in this study is that all of the testing came back identical, meaning that if they tested you and me and your wife and all of our friends, we would all come back as Homo sapiens. Well, all of these came back as a unique species in and of themselves, human, modern human, but very, very unique. I should also clarify that they went through specific testing as well. They aren't Neanderthals and they aren't Denisovas, so that's out of the picture. These are thinking, breathing, intellectual people that are quite different. If you look at all of the researchers, the older ones that were the mainstay that wrote a lot of the books with ape in them and the North American ape, et cetera, those are all going to be history lessons for us because it kind of invalidates all of those findings. I want to know that we're making progress. I wanted to know that we were moving forward. I do know that this most recently came from someone in Russia. The person knew a lot about what was going on. So I don't know exactly how they knew, but I knew that we're very far along with a journal. I believe it's imminent, probably within the next 7 to 10 days. I know that Dr. Ketchum said, well, she'll clarify some of what was been leaked rather than just let it sit out there, and that's the reason she came out like this. Since I got inside the Bigfoot world several years ago and I started to do this kind of work, and you try to do it with a real pragmatic approach, using professional standards, et cetera. And when you approach people in these academic institutions with this evidence, say it was hair or it was a bone or something, it's discounted almost immediately, and the people in some areas are actually afraid to touch it. Before we found Dr. Ketchum, we had interviewed several other labs. Dr. Ketchum had probably the best answers to our questions when we approached her, and that's one of the reasons we went to her with this. But the reality of it is that some scientists in some areas are so closed-minded to this possibility, it's hard for me to call them scientists with that type of attitude. We had certain samples from certain areas, but we wanted a pretty much a cross-section. And when we made the appeal on your show a couple of years ago, we got the response that we were looking for, and I would say probably 95% of those appeared to be good samples. Once you start working with that many people that are just a cross-section of the world, that are outside that world of science, there's bound to be leaks. They're going to tell their brothers, their sons, their daughters, and it's just bound to come out sooner or later. Well, I think a lot of people had a hunch because people really in the know that are deep within this arena, that actually go out and really go in the woods and really try to do research to gain the trust of people that have had these type of encounters. They've known, as I've written about, away from this study, they've known all along that these are people. I've written in my books that these things have qualities about them that are nothing even close to apes and gorillas, yet it's been ignored many times by some of the best supposed researchers out there. If you just go by the pure science, what Dr. Ketchum has released, they have all the qualities that you and I have with this one little twist about an unknown male side. I don't think you can just automatically jump to, that means they come from another dimension or they come from another world. It may be hard for science to admit that maybe we really don't have everything categorized that's been here for thousands of years. I've believed all along by research that we've done that the government knows and has known for many, many decades that they exist. A lot of it comes back from their denial on FOI, Freedom of Information Act requests, their constant statements that they lose documents, their statements that they don't remember things, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's a certain section of the world that absolutely knows. Let's look at Russia for a second. They're one of probably the most advanced of all the countries besides us in saying that these things exist in their country. Few countries are willing to admit it, but Russia is one of those that actually had a big conference on this last year in their country where they brought in researchers from all over the world. I think that certain people know. I think certain governments know. I think it may be a hard pill to swallow that it's going to get the publicity it's going to get. And I think that if you're a science-oriented person, it's hard to ignore the quality of science that Dr. Ketchum and his team has put together. In fact, if you're a science-bred person, you can't ignore it. I had hundreds and hundreds of emails saying, no, don't stop, here's a lead. And the truth is that there's probably far more going on in North America than we really understand. It's overwhelming almost how much knowledge we have now on these things. I mean, we have been absolutely blistered saying by a certain element, and we don't know what element it is, that are saying that we've just plopped these cases together and we're trying to sell a story, we're con men because we're doing this. When in the reality is that there's a lot of kids that we wrote about that have never been found. We never stated what's causing this because we don't know for sure. And for the people out there that have had children, think about a 21-month-old boy that's sitting in the living room with his puppy and you, and the door to the room is locked. The mom walks out of the room to use the bathroom. Somehow or another, and nobody knows how, the front door gets unlocked. The boy and the dog go outside. The mom steps back in the room after using the restroom only a couple minutes, and this house sits in an area that's probably 150 or 200 yards to the woods, and there's a field, a cleared field that surrounds the home. She walks out, she doesn't see anything. No dog, no boy, no nothing. And there was also another small puppy in a small pen right outside the house, and that puppy was gone. A massive search goes on. So really, how fast can a 21-month-old run under the best of conditions? Well, about 2 miles from the home, there's a river called the Tiger, Tyger River. Late in the afternoon, 24 hours after the boy disappears, 2 deputy sheriffs are in kayaks on that river looking for a body. A helicopter's flying up and down the river looking for this boy. And they make a pass around this turn and this bend in the river, and they go through a small straight section. The kayakers, right after the helicopter clears that, they go around the bend, go down the river, and in the middle of the river, on a sandbar, sits this little boy. In our efforts to get the evidence, we went about it a totally different way than anybody else. And some other groups were funded for up to 8 years to find DNA, and no one else did. So I think that it takes thinking outside the box and a certain ability to be able to find them and know they're in a certain area and then be able to get their DNA. You got to remember that these things have lived for thousands of years in complete safety. There's a group that's hunting them right now in the Texas-Oklahoma area, and they've been hunting them with a massive group for the last 2 years, and they haven't gotten in, and they won't. These things are smart. These Bigfoot, Sasquatch are very, very smart beings. They're not going to be an easy target, even if you sent a group of people out there trying to hunt them. I'm really not that concerned about that. But yes, part of the edict also is to get protection mechanisms in place. And because they are slightly different than human beings, Homo sapiens, there's probably going to be some different language to protect them as well. It sort of matches what other tribes have stated all across the U.S. And when you try to find a group of people that have been here hundreds and hundreds of years and occupy the land, to find a group that says they're an animal, I never could find it. So one thing I did with the Gimlin film, and one thing Harvey has the ability at, is let's say somebody goes into a bank, robs the bank, has a beard on, has a hat on, and they're caught on camera leaving. Well, Harvey has this innate ability to take the beard off the face so you can see what the face looks like, so you can identify the suspect. So apply that to the Patterson-Gimlin film. Harvey took the hair off the face of the Patterson-Gimlin biped. It's in tribal Bigfoot, and it's stunning. It looks like a Native American man. I think people forget how different humans are. In my presentations at conferences, I sometimes will take a variety of photos of Amazon tribal members, of people from northern Ukraine, of people from China, and I put these pictures up there, and it's phenomenal how different humans look. If they are some type of human, as I think they are, then it just follows with what we understand about our own people. So think about a 12-year-old kid who doesn't have much association with fire. Not a grown adult comes into the fire, is playing with it because they have this unique opportunity. That's kind of what I was thinking as I read that article. It's from California, I think from the mid-1800s. And I think it was a hunter that knew something was messing around, but he couldn't figure it out, so he waited on a ridgeline. They came in, and he saw this. It's not unusual that hunters and campers and other things in the woods have seen these things doing unusual things. Other times they're seen in a lake playing like kids in the water. Again, the behavior that you read about reminds you sometimes of children, and especially when the sizes match proportionally a smaller Bigfoot, you think, well, it must be a young kid. And, sometimes I question the credibility of some of these articles because who saw it? How did they get to those conclusions? Was there any evidence left behind? These older articles are sometimes tough to get to the root of where they came from or how they came to those conclusions. I don't put a lot of emphasis on that, but in the near term, I've never found a Bigfoot nowadays that's conclusively killed anybody. When I started writing the Missing 411 books, there's a lot of erroneous information that I have associated this topic on Bigfoot with Missing 411. I never have. I've never stated that I thought that Bigfoot was involved in these things. Why? Because I've never read a credible article implying that they did. Since the 411 books came out, all of a sudden, people have started saying, oh, yeah, this campsite, these campers were killed, this was happening. And I get these once a year or say, and every time I follow it up, I find that it's not a credible source, it never happened, yet the myths keep perpetuating on the internet, and they're not true. Some people believe, it's a cover-up. As someone who has spent an enormous amount of time in these rural areas with these rural sheriffs and deputies, those people do not give a damn about what the federal government thinks about their behavior, and trying to convince them to keep their mouth shut, that's never going to happen. They will tell the truth. The feds aren't going to be able to keep them clamped up. So when you hear these stories, these campers were killed by something really mysterious, if it was happening, I'd hear about it from these guys. And they say, half the time they say, it never happened. It's a completely phony story. How can you leverage it as credible if supposedly they were getting carried off? Who saw it? And why aren't the names there? And if somebody's writing about it, then say it. The number of times I have heard a hunter say, there's no way I could shoot it, it looked too human. I have never heard of a hunter say, oh yeah, I had to kill this thing, I shot it in the head, or it looked like an animal. I have not heard that. I've heard the human side of it from a fireman, policeman, credible sources that continually say the same thing. And it isn't just one time in history, it goes way back in history. So there's something to this that got askew where they said they started looking like apes and animals, and there's this segment of the Bigfoot world that wants to go out and kill one. I don't have any idea why they think they need to kill one. Maybe it's some kind of overload on testosterone, but they should wake up to the reality they're never going to kill one. It's not going to happen. Probably the one case, the Minnesota wild man, that has a lot of intrigue to it because I've seen pictures of it and I've seen descriptions of it, and it is unusual. Nobody quite knows what happens to it, but a lot of people just poo-poo it and say, that was a fake meant for the circus. But the more you dig into that one, there was something strange with that. It's an interesting phenomenon when you start to look at the sighting locations in conjunction to the giant sightings, skeletons, and then if you go back in history and you think about where did we first establish civilization and cities, and as we moved west, where were these locations? But then even the weirder thing to me is Ohio has a lot of these sightings. Bruce Maccabee lives in Ohio. He's a friend. I went to spend 4 or 5 days with him earlier this year. And the strange things that he's told me that have happened in Ohio, in the air and on the ground, it's really strange. When you look at the descriptions that they're offering, it's almost identical to what they're seeing here in the U.S. at the same time period or thereabouts. And then when you think about present-day sightings, again, from almost every continent in the world, which is unusual. People always tell me, well, what about the Star Wars creature that looks like Bigfoot? I said, yeah, that's kind of strange. Unusually and occasionally, even nowadays, you hear about Bigfoot wearing clothing. It kind of goes unexplainable because why would they do that? But, maybe it's some association. Maybe they're trying to break a barrier if they're seen. Maybe they think they'll be accepted more if they're seen. Maybe people won't be so scared. We could all throw in our conjecture about why that may be happening, but it happens too often for people to be fabricating it. I hear it occasionally, but not very often. There's famous stories out of Arizona and New Mexico on the high plains out there where they have these, and many times an association between, and this is where Bigfoot people their heads start spinning, but where there's this association between Bigfoot and UFOs. Even in the Hoopa book, I wrote that many of the tribal people said that they saw a UFO in close time and space to the point where they saw a Bigfoot. And they regularly saw UFOs on many of the tribal grounds. And when you talk to these tribal members, the elders, they believe they came from the stars. Once they have your trust, they will tell you, hey, there's this association between us and them, and they're a different kind of tribe and different kind of people, but they came from the same place we did. When you start to go back and you look at the history of these certain areas, there's a lot of tribal people that will tell you, we've had visitations for hundreds and hundreds of years going back in time, and almost all of them believe that they came from the stars. This is the part that really, really is unusual. Several years ago, one of my best friends, their parents own a dairy farm. And I started talking to him about this, and I said, I keep reading that they may be milking cows. What do you think about that? And he goes, let me go talk to my parents. So they own a huge dairy farm. And he went out there and talked to him, and I think he's 80 years old, this guy's dad. And he looked at him and he said, every once in a while my cow will come back from nowhere completely milked. I don't understand it. The same man told him, he says, every once in a while I'm on the far corner of my property and something tells me, don't turn around. Get back on the horse or get back on my ATV and leave. And he does. And then the man said, well, every once in a while I found a bucket way out in the corner of the property. I don't know how it got there. I think when you get the trust of some of these dairy farmers way out in the middle, they're going to tell you the same thing because I've heard it many times. Well, according to the tribal people who have seen them take deer, et cetera, they're an omnivore. And many times when the natives are in the middle of the woods hunting themselves, they'll come across a deer that's stuck up in a tree. And like a 250-pound deer, a native guy couldn't have done it. And they don't know how it got way up in the tree. How did it get there? So drones are an interesting topic, but there was actually some PhD-level people that thought that drones were going to be good for finding Bigfoot, and that was a complete bomb. Drones are never going to work for a Bigfoot topic. The missing people topic, they have used drones before on missing people. It hasn't worked real well. You can't use a drone in a national park. It's against the law, and there's a huge fine, so probably won't happen. Well, the description that Smith gave would match a Bigfoot. But then there's people who are researching this topic who believe that the Bigfoot may be some type of Nephilim from the Bible. And when you read that, there is some association there that makes some sense. Now, Scott Carpenter, another researcher in the Bigfoot world, has written a book about this. It's compelling, and there's some strong evidence that he's come across that may join the two topics. And other things, like in the Smith incident, the part that's unusual is that it came and it spoke to him. And he never said it mind spoke, but more like it spoke to him. So I've always stated that I'm a man of facts. All of my books are filled with facts. There aren't any opinions about what's going on. I allow you to come to your own opinion. And why do I do that? Because there are no facts to establish any current pattern that points to one suspect. When you look at the Bigfoot world, there's nothing that points to an exact equation of what we're dealing with other than the DNA. But again, if you stick with the facts and allow the public to come to their own thoughts, I have never met anybody who's read my 8 books, and there have been thousands, that has come to me and said, I know exactly what's happening. A girl disappeared in Wyoming, and 2 people who were poaching were out in the woods, and they claimed that they saw Bigfoot carrying this body under its arm. It appeared dead. These people never came forward. I don't know who they are. The story was given to me from another Bigfoot researcher that's well known, and this guy was called supposedly by these two guys, and then he told me. So it's third hand down the line. I would say might be true, might not, but there's no evidence that it is. And when you talk to the Native Americans, some of them say that Bigfoot does bury their bodies. When they bury them, they put giant boulders on top so that they'll never be disturbed. Another story I've heard is that they'll bury them in a river under giant rocks, and they'll carry the body out into the middle of the river. They'll put it under giant boulders in the river, and it'll dissipate and never be found. The idea is that the body's never touched. So it could be true. I think the Patterson-Gimlin film has never been debunked. Disney Studios came out and said that at that time, they could have never made a costume that was as good as what was in that segment. So it's a 1.5-minute segment in 1967. I want everyone to think about what was the percentage of people in the wilderness in 1967 that had the ability to take film of anything while they were in the wilderness. It was minute. Now think about today. Nobody has ever come close to taking video or film of a Bigfoot in the wilderness for 1.5 minutes like they got on that PG film. Yet today, there's probably close to 100% of everybody in the wilderness carrying a smartphone, which has the ability to catch that. So I want everyone to understand that I do believe the Patterson film is real, but why haven't we caught this biped on film in that quality of a location and segment like they did in 67? There was something phenomenal about that event that caused that female Bigfoot to stay there. Because every other time, they immediately run. They won't look at the camera like this one did. They won't hang around and linger knowing that people are watching them. Something unusual happened. Again, one of the reasons that makes this entire topic difficult to research. For many years, there's been a lot of people that have taken different venues and ideas trying to understand how they can come to some resolution with it. And from the get-go, we started off understanding that DNA would probably be the solution. And we first tracked to the idea that we wanted to understand what we were dealing with. And the best way to do that, when I look back on my law enforcement career, was utilizing a law enforcement forensic artist to sit down with witnesses and draw exactly what the witness observed. And this hadn't been done before by other researchers. And because of my expertise in dealing in that venue, I knew that a good forensic artist, when they sat down with a witness, would draw exactly what the witness saw. We chose Harvey Pratt from Oklahoma. Harvey is the chief forensic artist for the state of Oklahoma, and as of a month ago, he is now the director for the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation. He's a man of incredible integrity and an absolutely outstanding artist. Every time Harvey sits down with somebody, when they're done, they are amazed that Harvey can get this out of them and show exactly what they observed. There's so many stories out there about this is an ape, this is a gorilla. But then once you start to talk to the Native Americans, and I don't mean just one tribal group, I mean across North America and Canada, of course, you start to listen to what they have to say, and they have never stated that this is an ape or a gorilla. They've always stated that this is another tribe of Native Americans. They look a little different. They act a little different. They're a little more elusive, but they're another tribe of people. And once the drawings started to show consistency, and I'm not talking maybe 5 or 10 drawings, I'm talking dozens and dozens of drawings, and sitting down with the witnesses and listening to their descriptive analysis of their own drawing, it's obvious that these things have some type of genetics that are similar, if not exactly parallel with ours. Tule River Indian Reservation in sort of south central California near Fresno, they have an area right next to a river that archaeologists have dated it back almost 1,500 years. The drawings are that this tribe put on these rocks, and they look just like Bigfoot. And when you talk to the elders, they say, yep, our ancestors drew these because they were caretakers of the woods. They took care of us. They kept the grizzly bears away, and they took care of our tribe. If you don't look at those drawings and you say, well, 1,500 years ago, these people were drawing exactly what we're seeing today. There's a consistency down along the lines. Even in the 1700s, there are newspaper articles about big, hairy monsters or big, hairy people that were chasing others and stealing livestock. I was up near the Hoopa Indian Reservation up in Northern California. I'd made good friends there, and it was just a good base of knowledge. It's about 30 miles south of Bluff Creek, where Patterson and Gimlin made their film. Doing some research, we found out that this woman, Lucy, very well-educated Yurok woman, lived on the Klamath River, and she wrote about her experiences, and they were across the board, how it was living there, how it was trying to get by, some of the perils of living along the river. And then she talked about these things called Indian devils. And the Indian devils are described as coming into their village at night, sometimes stealing food, sometimes waiting until the male warriors left for the day to go kill deer, etc. And when they were gone during the day, the Indian devils sometimes would come down and take a woman, take a young girl, take a child. And they would take them for different reasons. And sometimes the warriors would go out and get them back. Sometimes they would find them charred and cannibalized. It almost sounded as though that it was on a need basis. Sometimes they needed a mate, and they would take one. Sometimes, maybe during a hard winter, they would take one to eat. There was a consistency in the story when we started to step across the U.S. and talk about other tribes. Same thing was happening in Washington. Same thing was happening in Oklahoma. There is that consistency to the story that cannot be ignored. A very well-educated Indian elder once told me, said, Dave, it's sometimes hard to understand and reconcile that. But imagine this, that if you were a group of, say, 50 humans living in a village, and you had a problem child that you couldn't tame and you couldn't take care of, and you excommunicated them from your group and you said, get out of here, you go live someplace else. Well, probably that happened because they couldn't live by your rules. Once they left, they didn't have to live by anybody's rules anymore. But if you buy the line that Bigfoot, Sasquatch has these human genetics in it, and every once in a while, a semi-civilized group excommunicates one and tells them to leave. Well, maybe it's that rogue one out there that can't be tamed and can't be civilized and does bad things because, hey, we know in human genetics, we've got bad people, too, that do some horrendous things. When Harvey and I went back to Oklahoma, and Harvey has Native American himself, he broke down some ground for us so we could talk to some elders face-to-face and get what we believe to be the truth about it. There were these shapeshifters, according to the elders, back 100 years ago. And as time has moved forward, they're harder and harder to find, although they supposedly do exist. I think that could have been a way at times for them to reconcile this in their mind, how odd the behavior is, how unusual it is. And trust me, they do have some unusual behavior, and they have some abilities that we don't have. But if you can reconcile that by calling him a shapeshifter, but when you talk to the elders, that's very, very rare, even in their community 100, 200 years ago, to find somebody that could do that. It wasn't common. Well, let's think about the human race for a second and say, if I put you in the middle of Beijing, China, and I said, grab the 3 closest people to you in Beijing, and then we go to the middle of the Senegal desert, and I say, grab 3 of the closest people to you, and then we go to an NBA basketball game, and I say, step onto the middle of the NBA floor and grab 3 of the closest players to you. Well, how different are those people going to look when you stand them next to each other? If you understand how different human genetics is and how many different races we have in and amongst ourselves, when you start to look at the Bigfoot phenomena, whether it's called Almasty in Russia or Yeti in Nepal, these bipeds exist on every continent and in many, many, many countries. And it's just not a 20th century issue. It goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So if you have that genetic evolution and that change, and if every once in a while they grab a human against their will, as Lucy described, and they use them as a wife, and they try to have kids with them, then eventually those genetics are going to get involved, and everybody's going to look a little different. If all of these Bigfoot looked exactly alike, that would be suspect. But having them have that differentiation that you would find in human genetics, in people, in communities, it makes more sense to us. There's a very famous case where David Thompson was an explorer, and he was up near Jasper, Alberta, Canada in the 1700s. And he got onto some tracks, and he was with guides at the time, and they found these giant human-type tracks with a huge stride in the absolute middle of nowhere. And Thompson wrote about him several times and talked about him later in his life, how he couldn't reconcile what it was. And other people said, oh, it's just a giant grizzly or something. And he came back and he said several times, no, it couldn't have been a grizzly. And it bothered him at that level. Then if you go back to Tule River and you say, well, 1,500 years ago they had these things drawn on walls, they look identical to what a silhouette of a Bigfoot Sasquatch is today. And if you can think, well, a lot of people put all the relevance into what Jerry Crew named Bigfoot in 1958 up at Bluff Creek. And really, it's just been everybody falsifying and hoaxing ever since. But if you go back in the record, even to the starting of newspapers, there are these stories. Trappers in trapper journals. When the people came over on the boats to the California coast, there are talks about them hitting land and running up against hairy giant people. Same thing on the East Coast. One of the things we did early on was not only did we do our research on the researchers in this field, but we also did that historical search to try to understand how much validity we can put into it before we move forward. And it was overwhelming how much there is. And I put it in tribal because I want people to understand that there is background to this that's valid, and there's this historical record that if you just kind of match the lines on a map, just like you match the line on a pin drawing of crimes, you can see that it starts to make sense. It didn't all happen on the West Coast. It's been going on throughout the United States and Canada for years. There's not one climate or one elevation where they proliferate and they don't exist. They exist sometimes in the desert areas of Southern California. I've heard so many different stories from different people, but what I tell anybody is I say, if you give me 4 hours of your time, I'll make you a believer that that Patterson film is absolutely a photo of a living hairy biped. Those guys did a phenomenal job. They were unbelievably lucky. And as I've spoke about at conferences, it was like the perfect storm for Bigfoot. These guys not only got a Bigfoot, they got a Bigfoot in the middle of an open area. They got him open for 30, 40, 50 seconds. They found one that was extremely hairy and didn't run. It stood there and walked across an open area. At the beginning, when the film started, it was semi-near a wooded area and could have turned and disappeared into it. For some reason, it didn't. And gave him an opportunity to film it. And what I tell people is I say, what are the odds of today a person walking through the woods that has some kind of video device compared to 1967? It's got to be enormous. We all have something on us these days that has a video device. But you know what? That film hasn't been duplicated. No one has gotten good footage of a Bigfoot since 1967. There's peculiarities about it that strike as highly unusual, and these guys were very, very lucky. Great weather, an open area. It stayed out in the open. They were able to film it. My gosh, how lucky is that? Once you look at that film frame by frame and you see the muscles move and it flex as it puts its foot down, and there's a couple injuries on it, it would have been impossible to make that in 1967 with the degree of definition that there was. Even today, I think it would be very, very difficult. In the last 6 months, we've filed probably 20 or 25 different Freedom of Information Act requests. If you look at the Patterson-Gimlin film, another oddity to it is that they caught a female Bigfoot. And our guess is maybe 1 out of every 10 sightings by a witness is a female. So it's a rare occurrence. That's another part of the enigma of that film. We were in Yakima, Washington, and I was meeting with Patricia Patterson. And Patricia has 5 plates that were made from the original Patterson-Gimlin film. And these plates are highly developed, meaning the picture that you can get off this plate is probably 10 or 15 times better than taking a photo of the frame of the film. And some people had gone up before us and had it scanned, and they did it at a very low resolution. We took the whole day, and at the absolute highest resolution, we got copies of these scans, and we gave them to some people to study. Well, while I was there, 2 of us walked into the shop that rented Roger Patterson the camera that took the film. one of the owner's sons is still there. And I asked him if there's anything unusual that never really came out of this regarding the camera. And he says, well, the most unusual thing is, he said when he was 14 years old, the FBI, 2 agents came inside of his store when he and his dad were working there and asked to see the camera that Roger Patterson rented. And his dad said he didn't have it. And the agent said, well, can you get it? And his dad said, well, I don't know if I can because I'm not exactly sure where it's at. And he said, but why can't I just give you a similar camera and that'll probably do the trick for you? And the agent said, no, we want that camera. And he said, well, why do you want that camera? And he said that they wanted to measure the speed that film was set at to understand how fast that biped was walking. So that was almost 2 years ago now I was there. And we immediately came back and filed a Freedom of Information Act request on the FBI files associated with that request. We write these very well because we have a couple friends that are agents that told us, if you write specific language, they're going to give you specific things, and if you don't, they're going to give you a lot of garbage. And we rewrote that thing 4 different times, and 4 different times the FBI said there's no such record of anybody visiting that shop, no such record of any investigation into Patterson, Gimlin, or the footage. We have literally probably written 60, 70 different letters about this to them, and they claim that there's nothing and that they've never had an interest in it. We've been in other locations and people have told us that the FBI came in and asked them about things related to Bigfoot. And let's go back to that Patterson-Gimlin film for a minute. There's a certain frame there where the biped turns and looks right at the camera. And one of the plates we have, very high resolution. It's a perfect picture of this thing turning around and looking. So Harvey Pratt is an expert of, say, taking a bank robbery photo where a guy puts on a beard and mustache and goes in and robs a bank. Well, Harvey can go in and take the beard and the mustache off the person and let everyone see what he looks like without the costume on. So we came back and we said, Harvey, can you do this with this picture? He said, yeah. And then he looked at it and he said, whoa, you guys are onto something. He took the hair off, and to me, what it looks like is it looks a lot like a Native American man. And to that point, if you go back to what the Native Americans in Washington and in British Columbia said in the 1920s, that this is another tribe, and if you listen to what Lucy said about them interbreeding, it all starts to fall together, that these things have this genetic line. But they also have an enormous ability to speed and strength that obvious humans don't have. Back in the Cold War era, Russia was looking at the possibility of using ape and gorilla hybrids as military people. A lot of the scientists out in Russia that were studying the Almasty or the Bigfoot of Russia thought that there was a possibility that they were trying to maybe use some parallel Almasty as a soldier. So maybe that there was some person in the government that heard that Russia was doing this there and said, well, maybe we should be looking into this as well. Why our government would be concerned, or why would they want to keep this a secret? I think the obvious starts to come out the more you listen to governmental reps' stories about why these things aren't recorded in official docs. We've talked to a lot of rangers who have had sightings, and they're told by their supervisors, don't write it down. I just interviewed a guy the other day. He worked for the National Park Service. Supervisor told him, don't write it down. If you think about the government's control over everything, very rarely does the government ever want to say, we can't control the situation. If there ever is a situation that they can't control, it's Bigfoot in the woods of the world, because they have no control. They may have some knowledge that they're not telling us about, but obviously their speed, their ability to conceal themselves, the ability to use languages that we don't understand, but some Native Americans do. If they said, hey, are we safe out there? How can the government say yes or no if they can't even claim that they exist? A group of 3 different tribes got together, and they actually held a press conference because they heard that some sheriff was going to go out and hunt these things. And they stated that they have the ability to mimic animals in the forest. So sounds you may hear really aren't the sounds you may be thinking, like owls and other birds and things, but they're Bigfoots communicating with each other. They don't look a lot like us because they're real hairy and they're real big, but generally they're passive unless you try to hurt them or unless you get them mad. So don't go out there and try to hunt them. Then you hear these stories about people, and I've heard so many that they're sleeping in a tent, and they hear the rumble and that's how it's described many times, of these things walking up at their campsite because they're so heavy, 800-900 pounds. They feel the earth move a little bit, and then they feel it right next to their tent. It runs the gamut. They have a feeling of immense fright, so much so that sometimes they can't move. Sometimes there's horrific odor associated with it. Very rarely is the tent ever touched or assaulted, but every once in a while it is. But the general thing is that they can't move. Maybe there is something to that. I don't know. But till we understand it, or till we have some kind of chemical analysis of what's going on in the air or something along those lines, it's really hard to put our finger on what may be causing that. But I do know, because I have been in law enforcement situations myself, I've been pretty scared many times. Not to the point of where I can't move, but maybe your thinking is impaired at some level where, you're maybe not as reacting as fast as you would in a normal situation because you're trying to understand what may be occurring to you. It's hard to say. If you talk to Native Americans, they will tell you that if you want a better chance of seeing a Bigfoot, you ride in on a horse because the human odor's up off the ground. I interviewed a wife of an individual named Sil McCoy, and Sil was the head of the U.S. Forest Service station in Willow Creek in the 50s and 60s. And Sil was an amateur researcher himself, and he and Bob Titmus one day decided that they were going to try to see a Bigfoot because there were certain tracks that were coming out of the Trinity River at this one location. And these guys were smart enough to get up in a Douglas fir tree 100, 150 feet up out of the air and sit there all night because they knew get themselves up off the ground, they would have a better chance. So all researchers out there, that is the correct way to go. Because you talk to natives, you talk to the older researchers, you got to get that odor up off the ground, and a Bigfoot will walk right by. And the best example is you can read dozens of sighting reports from people in deer stands. I included a report from the Army Corps of Engineers out of Washington, but that wasn't from a FOIA request. It was more of our own research where they talked about Bigfoot in an almanac that was produced by the Army Corps of Engineers in Washington. And they talked about it like it was a real being. That was interesting. But we have laid into it heavily in just the last 6 months, just like with a razor-fine edge, asking specific questions on specific issues at specific locations. This ranger that we interviewed the other day, I got that from a U.S. Forest Service law enforcement officer who heard that this guy had actually seen one. We went and interviewed him. He goes, I'll go on camera with it. I'll explain what happened. But there were 3 of us in this one area. We all saw one at different times. We were told not to report it. Nobody wanted to hear about it. Why? I think that there's several different factors that could be considered the Holy Grail. Let's look at the footprints for a second. There's an individual named Jimmy Chilcott out of Texas that was a police technician. There's something called dermal ridges in a person's foot, kind of like the fingerprint of the foot. In several casts going back decades, he found these dermal ridges in the casts of these large, giant prints. And literally, those couldn't be faked or hoaxed. He made several presentations that I've seen where he said, hey, these are real footprints from a real creature, but they're not made by a human print because the dermal ridges go at an angle that human ridges don't. So that's one thing. Now, hair offers us some real obstacles, and I've got the best lesson of probably anybody out there because I've been at this now for 27 months with Dr. Ketchum and her staff. In a human hair, 95% of human hair has a medulla in it. The medulla is a solid core that goes down the center of the hair, and in that is our DNA. At the follicle level, there's nuclear DNA. And maybe 4 or 5% of the human hair doesn't have this medulla in it, and it's absent. Well, it's almost opposite for Bigfoot hair. Maybe 98 or 99% of Bigfoot hair, if it has a medulla, the DNA in it is so fragmented, is so minimal, that it's not workable. Until we've got multiple samples, and we tried this over and over again, it just doesn't work. And so what I tell everybody, if you have a hair, and it doesn't have a follicle at the end, it's worthless for getting DNA at a Sasquatch Bigfoot level. We need the follicle. The follicle, obviously, is the core, the root that goes into the body. And unfortunately, for Bigfoot hairs, very small percentage of these hairs have follicles. Whether it's the way the hair comes out, whether it falls out at some level very easily, we don't know. But we've been lucky. We have some samples out of Oregon, some out of California, some out of Alaska, and some out of Mid-America that are good samples. And that started it off working with Dr. Ketchum. And she has been one person that has shown an exorbitant amount of energy and interest because people that are hair and fiber experts have seen these hairs and they've ruled that they are like nothing else out there in the world. And there's no other animal, there's no other human that could have a hair like this. They look a lot like primate hairs, but there's no primate out there that has this exact kind of hair. This has been stated before, and this isn't really anything new. But I suppose when she hears it from somebody that she deems credible, and he raises her interest level like he did way back when we started this, and now she starts to get into the DNA extraction from follicles of hairs, and it starts to raise her interest even more when she starts to have some strange returns come back. We've been lucky. We've got some bone. I just submitted a bone to her the other day, and some other people have brought in some other samples. We have some tissue samples and some other things that are looking very, very promising. We've come to this resolution just in the last year that there's probably been 40 or 50 cases that we can document where a Bigfoot's been shot. In many, many cases where one's been shot, a second one has been seen. And there's probably a dozen or more cases where there have been 4 or more Bigfoots seen at one location. There's a website called Bigfoot Encounters where there's a report in there and 14 Bigfoot were seen at a location. We believe that it's a rare occurrence that a Bigfoot travels alone. They probably are in at least multiples of 2 and maybe more. And they hide and they stay low and they conceal themselves very well. And it's like one person out at the point and everyone's behind. And if one gets shot, we think others come up, grab it, and take it home. And they leave with it. Now, early on when I was in Hoopa, elders told me, they took me out on the reservation and they showed us where on the reservation these things lived, in the most inhospitable areas you can imagine, way ups in rocks, crevices, places researchers won't go, don't want to go. And recently we've had a series of sightings way up on granite ledges where climbers were climbing and happened to see one. So all of a sudden this is starting to make sense to us that obviously they want to conceal themselves, they want to stay away from us, and they want their privacy. So why not make it in a location where we will never go? That's number one. Number two is every Native American tribe we have interviewed says that they bury their own. If they watch what Native Americans do, if they mimic their behavior, if they are a tribe in and of themselves, if they do take their own people when they're injured and they leave with them, that all starts to make sense.